this all ties in, doesn't it? Before we do get into the meat and bones, do not forget at the end of the day, you go to sleep and that wrestling is just somebody's job. And sometimes you go to your place of work and you fall out with your boss. And maybe the employer is right, maybe the company is right. We don't know, but it happens at McDonald's, it happens at Nike, it happens at, I don't know, Barclays Bank. We all just human beings trying to make our way. Given that we are talking about individuals that we do see every single week on television though, if there is a little bit of a controversy, everybody starts talking about it, and when that happens, you can't get the cat back in the shoe. And you're looking it up now, and no, that's not a saying. But the point is, these 10 wrestlers did quit over their contracts. Why? Here's why. So we shall start at number 10 with Sasha Banks and Naomi, and once again, nobody actually knows what is going on here, but when you do start to do some digging and you get into the rumour mill, not only does it sound like they stormed out because they weren't happy with creative, but it may have also tied into their contract situation. Because both are allegedly in the last few months of their contract, so I suppose if they weren't getting certain guarantees that they expected, and they weren't happy with the storyline, then Boss Glow, whatever the hell they're calling themselves, decided, I don't really think this is working out. I'm going out the door. Now, the real fascinating point, and the real reason I wanted to put this in here, is that do not forget, if you are a WWE contracted talent, that deal states that if you're not performing for one reason or another, WWE can freeze your deal, meaning until you fulfill your appearances, you just have to sit there and wait it out. So let's, for argument's sake, say the expiry date was July. Maybe it would have been a little bit better to have done a Dean Ambrose and just wait a little while before you turned yourself into Jon Moxley. But once again, I just think we all need to calm down with this, and I hope Sasha Banks and Naomi can work out their differences and go back to doing what they're flipping great at. But I ain't Stone Cold Steve Austin. Which ties into the main one that everybody is comparing this to, Stone Cold walking out in 2002. For those that don't know though, Austin did indeed not turn up to Monday Night Raw all those years ago, because he was told the plan for the evening was for him to lose to Brock Lesnar in a King of the Ring qualifying match, and understandably the Rattlesnake thought that was stupid, because the money isn't a random match on television, the money was in a big pay-per-view shindig, where Brock Lesnar probably would have won. The real twist to all of this though is that maybe, just maybe, WWE did this to be a little bit vindictive. Because weeks earlier, Steve Austin had been on the WWF Bite This show and said, well, I tell you, son, I don't really like the creative direction at the moment. And in fact, I think the writing sucks. So the powers that be didn't appreciate that, and they wanted blood, and all of this went bad quickly. And given the relationship that Austin had with McMahon, and the fact that he felt like they weren't living up to the deal or everything that he had crafted, he too got on a plane and he went home, and we didn't see him for almost a year. Now, Austin has admitted well after the fact that this was not the right way to handle it and he should have been more professional. But again, can anybody actually say his way of looking at things wasn't the right way? I would say no. Number 8, CM Punk. All it takes is 5 minutes on Google to make you realise, thank goodness CM Punk got out of WWE when he did. I mean, we can get into the if, buts and maybes, but it is quite clear both his physical and mental health were taking an absolute kick-in, and he needed some time to rest. And this is one big reason why he did quit, because if you're not aware, one of the things with WWE, especially back in the 2014 era, was that you were expected to return to work as quickly as possible, even if you had just had your knee reconstructed and you'd just come out of surgery. So Punk has told this story before, where he was essentially limping out of his local medical facility, where his phone rang and it was Vince McMahon saying, hey pal, need you at Raw next week, even though hours before this, he had been knocked out with anesthetic. I don't think that's good for anybody's brain, especially when you are trying to heal. And the reason CM Punk continues to do this, as he has mentioned, is because his hero was Harley Race, and he wanted to tie it into that old school mentality. Given that eventually he did just become the walking wounded though, after the Royal Rumble, he went and found Vince McMahon and Triple H and said, I don't want to do this anymore, I too am going home. And yes, because this was a breach of contract, WWE fired CM Punk on his wedding day. Now, we have talked about that a lot, but come on now, just don't do it. Number 7, The Rock. Quit may not be the right word here, but all things considered, man, what were we doing? We all remember The Rock when he went off to be a movie star, and in 2022, don't forget, he's been an actor way longer than he was a wrestler. But when all this was starting and Hollywood came a-calling, everybody in WWE realized what was going on, so they tried to tie all this up in a nice little package so they'd have the rights to his name and they'd get some of that money from his film. What they did not anticipate, though, is that Dwayne Johnson would find so much success. So when his WWE contract did come due in 2004, they just decided, well, we're not going to renew it, we'll show him. This didn't set well with Mr. Johnson, because why would it? And he was more than up for trying to come to terms on something new, and this is why it would be 7 years before 2011 rolled around and The Rock became the guest host of WrestleMania before he came back to the company. I mean, you think cooler heads would have prevailed with this one, and they did eventually, but yeah, WWE booted out who was going to go on to become one of the biggest stars in the world. Number 6, Cesaro. I love this story because good for Cesaro. His contract came due, WWE sat down to negotiate with him, he put a figure on the table, they said, well, we're not going to pay you that, and he said, okay, I'm done. Now, no matter what, this must have been hard because the Swiss Superman had been there for 11 years, but this is all about knowing your worth. If you'd seen a bunch of other figures being doled out to other wrestlers and you weren't being treated the same way, damn right you should stand up for yourself. I mean, we as a human race don't do this enough. It also kind of shows that WWE still don't realize what they had with Cesaro. And while I say these words, he hasn't returned to wrestling, but believe you me, wherever he does lay his hat, he is absolutely going to smash it. Because here's your homework for the day. Go and find a bad Cesaro match. Can't. Number 5, China. The story of how China and WWE fell out is actually quite sad, because do not pretend otherwise. During the Attitude Era, she was a super duper megastar and she changed the business. And then when it was time to renegotiate her deal, well, these people could not see eye to eye. Told best by Jim Ross on his podcast, Joni Lawler's big request when it was time for a new deal is that she wanted to be paid the same money as Stone Cold Steve Austin. Good old JR looked at her and said, well, that's never going to happen. We were at an impasse. There's also the problem that China didn't really want to wrestle women anymore and exclusively wanted to wrestle men, which is not what the company wanted to do. And this is why they did say goodbye, because Vince McMahon was like, well, I'm not paying her that, and I want her to wrestle females. So we were done. The part that really sucks is that she never returned to WWE and only really did a little bit more in wrestling when she went over to New Japan. But what will really break your heart is that she passed away in 2016 and never got to have that comeback that she so richly deserved. Now, thankfully today she has been inducted into the Hall of Fame, but all of this could have been so much more. Number 4, Bret Hart. I mean, do we really need to go through this one? Well, it's been talked about so many times, but seriously, how could I leave it out? Quickly though, back in 1997, Bret the Hitman Hart and Vince McMahon signed a deal, then a few weeks later Vince said, oops, sorry, I can't afford that, so I strongly suggest you go back to WCW try and get a bunch of money from them instead. Bret has always said too that he wanted to stay with the World Wrestling Federation but felt compelled to take World Championship Wrestling's offer because it was so much dough. And of course the way this all ties in is Survivor Series 1997 when Bret the Hitman Hart had creative control. So Vince said, well, I don't want you to have creative control, well, I'm just going to ignore it and I'm going to take that belt off you. So the terms of the contract were not adhered to and Bret did indeed leave and went to WCW. They had no idea what to do with him. That's a different video for a different day. Number 3, Ric Flair. Picture the scene. New WCW head honcho Jim Herd sits down the nature boy Ric Flair and says, I don't care what you've done in the past. I want you to cut your hair and I'm also going to start calling you Spartacus. I have not made any of that up. The real kicker is that Herd also wanted to pay Flair less money, which was never going to fly. And the real issue here was that WCW had decided to put somebody in charge who had no wrestling experience and was just looking at some numbers. However, this was Ric Flair, so he told Jim Herd to shove this contract and that he'd be leaving, and he did. Not only did he quit, he went across to the WWF and he took the WCW World Championship big gold belt with him. And my word, this opened the floodgates because it was just lawsuit central. Somehow Flair returned to WCW after all of this to a hero's welcome. And you would assume, well, I bet they never mucked him around on a contract again. But they did. Google everything that happened with Eric Bischoff. All of this was nuts. Number 2, Brock Lesnar. I mean, seriously, the balls of Brock Lesnar. Because do not forget, in 2004, he was everything to WWE. He was the next big thing. He was the beast. He was our bright new star. And we were going to do everything we possibly could to ensure he got to the top, and he stayed there. There's only one thing that could have derailed Brock, which was him waking up one day and deciding, you know what, I don't really like the wrestling lifestyle. And it actually happened. It was always going to cause a stink for obvious reasons, but they were able to come to an agreement in the sense they said, okay, Brock, we will let you out of your contract, but you have to sign this, a 7-year non-compete deal, so you can't go wrestle anywhere else. Lesnar was so desperate to leave, he probably would have signed his own mother away, but after he did try to get in the NFL and fail, he got offered a deal by New Japan Wrestling, and even though he did have this piece of paper, he ignored it, and he went to fight. This triggered a huge lawsuit, and was Lesnar completely ignoring the contract he had with WWE? But surprise, surprise, he fought them through the system, and judges went, WWE, you can't enforce this, why'd you even come up with it? This meant that Brock was a free man, and also underlines how big a star he came in UFC, because when it was time for him to make a jump back to pro wrestling, everybody was more than happy to work with him because they knew despite the past, they could do big things with the one and only Brock Lesnar. But one, Chris Jericho. I mean, this doesn't 100% tie into a contract, but it does sum up why Chris Jericho never returned to WWE, even though he had the chance. And the big reason for this is because he felt shunned. Because way back in 2016, 2017, Chris Jericho and Kevin Owens were doing the best stuff in WWE, including the Festival of Friendship. And according to Jericho, during all of it, McMahon had sat him down and said, oh my gosh, this is great stuff. We're going to have you headline WrestleMania for the big World Championship. So naturally, anybody is going to get pumped for that, even though, you know, plans can change. And then we got to that night in April, and Kevin Owens' Chris Jericho was not for a title, and it was on second. McMahon also wasn't a fan of the match, and Chris Jericho was actually insulted, mostly because he had realized it doesn't matter how many times I go away, it doesn't matter how many times I come back, I have been pigeonholed here. This is just my status in WWE, and I don't want that. So we left. I don't want to get into it here because we've run out of time, but the Wizard was correct because instead he went to New Japan, absolutely blew up those numbers, and then helped start and cement AEW to the point today he does feel like a bigger deal than ever. So you can say whatever you want about him, but he smashed it again. Know of any other wrestlers that quit over their contracts? Make sure you let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video, share the video, and subscribe. Then head over to WhatCulture.com where you can read articles like this with your eyes. Make sure you come follow us on social media. We have a lot of videos, seriously a ton of them. They're lonely, go watch one. My name is Simon WhatCulture. Thank you very much for joining me as always. I hope you have a lovely day, and try not to walk out over your contracts at work. It doesn't really work well in the real world. We all need that cash. Goodbye.